The fire had been burning for 6 months. Not the same fire, exactly. It had died and been relit dozens of times, fed through the nights by whoever woke first or slept lightest or had reason to rise before the others. But in the way that a fire in a longhouse becomes, over the course of a winter, less a thing you tend and more a thing you live alongside, a presence as constant and as necessary as the walls themselves, it felt like the same fire. It felt like it had always been burning and would always be burning, and the winter that pressed against the outside of the walls was the thing that was temporary, not the fire. This is where we are tonight. Welcome to Dull Tales. I'm glad you found your way here, wherever you are, in bed already with the lights low, or somewhere quiet where the day is finally releasing its grip on you. This is what we do here. We take history and we slow it all the way down, follow ordinary people through the specific texture of their lives, and try to find what was real and sensory and human in the middle of it all. No dramatic music, no bullet points, no dates in bold text telling you what to memorize. Just the story, told at the pace of spoken fire, the way it wants to be told. Tonight we're going somewhere cold. We're going to a Viking longhouse in the winter of approximately 900 AD, somewhere on the coast of Norway, and we're going to spend an entire winter there, from the first hard frost that locks the fjord to the first tentative warmth of a spring that felt, for several months, like it might not come this year. We're going to do it through the people who lived there, not the warriors and the saga heroes and the raiders of the history books, but the farmer and his wife, the thrall who has been here longer than anyone remembers, the grandmother who knows things about the old ways that the grandchildren are not quite sure they believe, the young man who is restless in the specific way that young men in enclosed spaces in winter are restless, and the animals who share the longhouse and who are, in their own way, as much a part of the story as anyone. Get comfortable, the fire is going, this one takes a while. And before we go further, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. I always want to know, and if this is your first time here, subscribe. There are more nights like this one waiting. Now the winter. The longhouse stands on a slope above the fjord. It has stood there for 40 years, built by the grandfather of the man who lives there now, on a site chosen with the specific practical intelligence of people who have been reading this landscape for generations. Far enough from the water to be above the flood line and the worst of the sea wind, close enough to the water to keep the boat accessible, sheltered to the north and west by the rising ground and the stand of birch trees that the grandfather planted, and that are now tall enough to be useful, facing south to catch whatever light the winter sun delivers on the days when it bothers to appear above the ridge. The building is approximately 30 meters long and 8 meters wide. These dimensions are not exactly architectural ambition. They are the result of the available materials and the available technique applied to the specific need, which is to shelter, under a single roof, a family of 8 people and their livestock through a Norwegian winter. The walls are timber and turf, thick enough that the temperature differential between inside and outside is significant, not warm exactly, not by any modern standard but survivable, which in a Norwegian winter is the standard that matters. The roof is also turf, laid over a timber frame, with a single opening at the ridge directly above the central hearth, through which the smoke escapes in theory. In practice, the smoke situation in a longhouse is one of its defining features, not in the sense that anyone has chosen it as a feature, but in the sense that it is comprehensive and constant and shapes everything. The quality of the air, the color of the walls, the smell of everything that spends time in the building, the condition of the eyes of the people who live there, which are chronically reddened and which improve noticeably on the days when the wind direction causes the smoke to draw well, and the interior briefly approaches something like clear air. On most days, it does not approach something like clear air. On most days, the smoke hangs in the upper half of the building at a height that requires the taller people. The man of the house is tall, to develop a slight habitual stoop, when moving from one end to the other, a posture so ingrained that he maintains it outdoors as well, which his wife has noted and not commented on in the specific way that marriages accumulate unspoken observations. The man's name is Gunnar. He is 43 years old, which is, in the world of 9th century Norway, a meaningful age, not old. Exactly, but past the point where mortality is an abstraction, and into the territory where it is a practical consideration that shapes decisions. He has survived a cattle illness that killed half his herd 12 years ago. He has survived 2 voyages to the west, one of which produced profit and one of which produced a scar on his left forearm, and a story he tells differently depending on the audience. He has survived 4 Norwegian winters as master of this farm, and 18 before that as the son of the man who was master before him, and the winters have built in him a relationship with cold and darkness, an enclosed space that is different from what people who have not experienced a Norwegian winter above the Arctic Circle can fully imagine. The relationship is not fear. Fear would be correct. In a way, the winter is genuinely dangerous, the cold is genuinely lethal, the darkness is genuinely comprehensive, the proximity to 40 other species, including the difficult ones, is genuinely testing. But fear is not quite the word for what Gunnar has. What he has is respect, in the specific form that respect takes when it is earned through decades of the thing being respected demonstrating its capacity to cause consequences. He prepares for winter the way a craftsman prepares for a difficult job, methodically, with attention to detail, without panic and without optimism. The preparations begin in late summer and continue through the autumn with a thoroughness that shapes the entire warm half of the year around the requirements of the cold half. The hay must be cut, dried, and stored, enough to feed the cattle and the sheep and the goats through however many months the winter turns out to be, plus a margin for the possibility that the winter turns out to be longer than expected, which in his experience it frequently does. The fish must be dried and salted, the cod and herring that come in the late summer runs, hung in long rows outside the smokehouse, until they are as hard as wood and can be stored almost indefinitely. The meat must be prepared, some animals slaughtered before winter, their meat preserved in salt and smoke and the cold of the storage pit, others kept alive through the winter for their milk and eggs and the future labor of those who can work. The grain must be ground, slowly, through the autumn, the stone quern turning in the evenings when the other work is done, producing the coarse flour that will be the basis of most of what they eat from October to April. The wood must be cut. This is the job that Gunnar begins thinking about in August, and that dominates September and October. The cutting and splitting and stacking of the firewood that will feed the central hearth through 6 months of darkness. The calculation is not precise. It can't be, because the winter's length and severity are not knowable in advance. But it is based on experience, on the memory of previous winters, on the particular quality of the autumn that suggests what kind of winter is coming. A dry summer usually predicts a cold winter. A late autumn, when the leaves stay on the birch trees into October, suggests the cold will come later but stay longer. He cuts more than he thinks he needs. He has always cut more than he thinks he needs. His father told him to, and his father's calculation was right enough times that Gunnar absorbed it as a principle without analyzing it, which is how most of the important knowledge of the farm operates, as embodied principle rather than explicit rule, built into the practice of the work rather than existing as a separate body of instruction. His wife Astrid manages the rest. Astrid is 39 years old, and she has been managing the rest of the farm's winter preparations for 17 years, since she came here at 22 from a farm 2 valleys to the east, and her management is thorough in the way that her husband's is thorough, but organized on different principles. Where Gunnar's preparations are about quantity, enough hay, enough wood, enough dried fish, Astrid's are about organization and distribution, and the specific domestic intelligence of keeping 8 people and their animals alive in a confined space for 6 months without the living arrangements becoming intolerable. This is a more complex management problem than it appears from the outside. The Longhouse in winter is 30 meters of shared space containing Gunnar and Astrid and their 4 children, ranging in age from 6 to 17. Gunnar's mother Ragnhild, who is 61 and has been old for a decade in the specific way that people were old at 60 in this century. A thrall named Ulf, who has been on this farm since before Gunnar was born and whose status, slave, technically, in the formal social structure, but something more complicated in practice, the someone who knows where everything is and how everything works and who has been here longer than everyone, makes him a category-defying P. Resents, and a young man named Bjorn who arrived 2 years ago from somewhere south and who works in exchange for food and shelter, and a portion of whatever surplus the farm produces, an arrangement common enough in this world, and sufficiently ill-defined in its terms that it is renegotiated in practice every season. Plus the animals. The animals are the aspect of the Longhouse winter that most surprises people encountering it for the first time, which is to say, the animals are in the building, not outside in a barn, the barn concept. The separation of livestock from human living space is something that will develop later in Northern European agricultural history. In the Longhouse, the animals occupy the far end of the building, the livestock end, separated from the human living and sleeping area by a low partition of timber that keeps the animals in their section, but does not prevent their presence from being comprehensively felt throughout the building. Felt, smelled, heard. The smell of the Longhouse in winter is one of its most definitive features, the detail that no amount of prior knowledge fully prepares you for, because smell is the sense that refuses abstraction and insists on the direct encounter. The smell is composed of smoke, which sits in everything, the animals, which contribute their specific and comprehensive biological presence, the people, who in winter wash less than in summer, partly because the cold water of washing is unpleasant, and partly because the warmth of not washing is real, the food being cooked, which produces the saving grace of the smell situation, the overlay of something appetizing that makes the rest bearable, and the particular organic quality of turf and timber, and the materials of the building itself, which have been absorbing the winter's contents for 40 years, and have developed an identity that goes beyond the sum of its components. Gunnar does not notice the smell. This is not insensitivity. It is simply the specific anosmia of the person who lives inside what they would otherwise smell. The visitors who occasionally come to the farm, a neighboring farmer checking on something, a trader making winter rounds, notice the smell when they enter. Gunnar, who has not left the building for more than a few hours since October, does not notice it any more than he notices the fire. It is simply what inside smells like. Astrid, who is slightly more self-aware about these things, notices it when she comes in from outdoors, the few minutes outside for necessary tasks, the animal feeding that requires going to the livestock end via the outside door, the occasional carrying of water from the stream that runs behind the building, and that stays unfrozen longer than the fjord because it is moving. And in those moments of re-entry, she is briefly aware of the smell and briefly aware of the specific texture of what it is to live in this building in winter, and then she goes in and loses it again. The children don't notice it at all. Let me introduce the children, because they are important, and because the experience of winter in a longhouse is experienced most vividly through the young, who have not yet built the accommodations that adults build with experience, and who therefore encounter the walls, the smell, the smoke, the noise, and the proximity with a directness that the adults have learned to manage. The oldest is a girl named Sigrid, 17, who is at the age where the longhouse is most acutely constraining. Sigrid has opinions. She has been developing opinions for 17 years with a specificity and a conviction that her parents have learned to navigate rather than oppose, because opposing Sigrid's opinions produces a quality of conflict that the Longhouse's acoustics amplify considerably. She has opinions about the sleeping arrangements, which she finds insufficient in the privacy they offer. She has opinions about her brother's behavior at meals, which she finds loud and inconsiderate. She has opinions about the thrall Ulf, whose presence in the space she finds difficult to categorize in the way that young people of her class and generation find the class category of thrall difficult to categorize. Not because she has principled objections to the institution, which would be historically anachronistic, but because Ulf specifically has been here forever and knows everything and is useful and yet is not in the formal social structure. Someone she is supposed to consider as she would consider a free person. She is also, though she would not put it this way, lonely. The farm in winter is a closed world, and the social life of Sigrid's generation, the gatherings at neighboring farms, the events that mark the calendar and create the occasions for young people to encounter other young people, are reduced by the weather and the dark to the occasional, the irregular, the rarer than she needs. She is 17, and she is in a room with her parents and her brothers and her grandmother and a thrall and a young farmhand, and the young farmhand is Bjorn, who is 20, and who she has been not thinking about for 2 years with the practiced intensity that teenage not thinking involves. Bjorn, for his part, is aware of this and does not know what to do with the awareness, which is itself a reasonable response to a situation that has very limited correct options. The second child is a boy of 15 named Leif. Leif is the one who will eventually leave. He doesn't know this yet, not consciously, but the signs are there for anyone who looks. The quality of attention he brings to the stories of the voyages, the way he listens when the men at the neighboring farm describe what they've seen to the west and the south, the specific restlessness that produces in him, a need to be moving, to be doing, to be somewhere other than here, that the winter amplifies to a point where it is almost physical. He is 15, and he is 4 meters from the wall of the Longhouse, and the wall feels, some days, like a much more specific barrier than it is. He manages this by working. Working is the management strategy for winter restlessness that the Norse tradition has developed as the correct one, and Leif has internalized it with a completeness that his father finds reassuring and his mother finds faintly alarming, because the quality of Leif's work has the edge of someone driving himself harder than the work strictly requires, which is a sign of something that Astrid can't yet name but recognizes. He carves in the evenings. This is one of the winter crafts, the long evenings given over to the making of things, the production of objects for use and for trade, the maintenance and improvement of equipment, the repair of what the summer's use has worn. Leif carves with a concentration and a precision that produces objects better than they need to be. A tool handle that works perfectly well without the decorative knotwork that he has spent 3 evenings adding to it. The knotwork not necessary but present, evidence of the surplus energy that the winter's confinement can't fully consume. The third child is a boy of 12 named Eric, who is simply a 12-year-old boy and therefore a force of nature in an enclosed space. Eric's relationship with the Longhouse winter is the most straightforwardly antagonistic of all the humans present. He is 12 and he cannot be outside, and he is therefore conducting the energies of a 12-year-old within 30 meters of enclosed space in a way that produces a constant background level of incident, the knocked-over pot, the disturbed sleeping arrangement, the argument with the animals, the specific brand of boredom that 12-year-olds produce when they have been inside for 6 weeks, and it shows. Gunnar manages Eric the way he manages all difficult problems, with patience and firm direction. Astrid manages Eric the way she manages all difficult problems, by giving him tasks. The tasks help to a point. The fourth child is the youngest, a girl of 6 named Helga, who is the person in the Longhouse who has most completely adapted to the winter's conditions, possibly because 6 years old is too young to have formed expectations that the winter violates. For Helga, this is simply what winter is. The building, the fire, the smell, the sounds, the particular warmth of the sleeping bench at night with her mother's body heat on one side and the warmth from the livestock end of the building on the other, which is real and consistent, and in the coldest part of winter is the difference between a survivable temperature and one that is not. Helga's relationship with the Longhouse is the relationship of someone who lives inside it rather than tolerating it. She knows every corner of it. She knows which boards creak and which are silent. She knows where the mice get in and where they go. She knows the specific sounds the building makes at different wind directions, the groan and the creak, and the occasional sharp report of the timber frame shifting under the weight of the snow on the turf roof. She knows the animals. The livestock end of the Longhouse holds, this winter, 2 cows, 4 sheep, 3 goats, and a horse. The horse is named in the way that horses on Norse farms are named, which is with the same matter-of-fact practicality applied to everything. He is called the Gray One, or sometimes just the horse, which is not a name so much as a description, and which suits him because he is a gray horse and he is the horse, those 2 facts being the primary relevant facts about him. The cows and the sheep and the goats are not named, because they will eventually be eaten, and naming things you will eventually eat is an emotional investment that the practical intelligence of the farm prefers not to make. Helga has named them anyway, with the confident disregard for practical intelligence that 6-year-olds deploy in these situations. The cows are Brun and Hvid. The sheep are all called some version of the sheep, with numerical distinctions that Helga maintains in her head with perfect clarity despite Gunnar's consistent refusal to use the system. The goat she is still deciding about. Now let me take you to the specific texture of a winter day in this place, because it is the texture, not the drama, not the events, but the daily sensory reality of what it is to be here, that I want to give you. The thing that the history books describe and the sagas don't bother with because the sagas are interested in the exceptional, and the daily is, by definition, unexceptional. A winter day in the Longhouse begins before the sun. In the depths of the Norse winter, the sun at this latitude rises late and sets early, offering perhaps 4 or 5 hours of gray, low, horizontal light before disappearing again. The day that the sun measures is therefore very short. The day that the farm measures is longer. The animals must be fed regardless of sunlight. The fire must be maintained. The food must be prepared. The work must be done. Astrid wakes first. She wakes first as she always wakes first, which is to say before she is fully rested, because the farm's morning is her responsibility to initiate, which means it begins when she begins it and not before. She lies for a moment in the dark and the warmth of the sleeping bench, which is one of the genuine physical pleasures of the Longhouse winter. The sleeping bench, lined with furs and wool blankets accumulated over years, is genuinely warm in the way that a well-built bed with good bedding is always warm, the body heat of the people on it held by the materials and by the partial enclosure of the bench's wooden sides. She can hear Gunnar's breathing beside her. Beyond him, the faint sounds of the children, Helga's particular almost soundless sleeping, Eric's slightly louder version. From the livestock end, the specific sound of animals in the small hours, the movement of a cow shifting position, the occasional quiet noise of a sheep, the gray horse's breathing which is, at this distance and in this silence, audible as a slow, deep, rhythmic exhalation. She gets up. The cold hits immediately. The cold of the Longhouse in the middle of the night when the fire has burned low, and the heat of the building has settled into the sleeping bodies rather than the air. It is cold in a way that is different from the cold outside, which is the absolute cold of a Norwegian winter night, but it is cold enough that the first minutes out of the sleeping bench require a specific willed commitment to being vertical. She puts on her outer layer, a wool dress, heavy, over the lighter garment she sleeps in and goes to the fire. The fire at 4 in the morning is a bed of coals, orange in the dark, still generating heat but not light. The embers collapsed into themselves after the night's burning. She adds fuel wood from the stack at the end of the hearth, the specific wood that is best for rebuilding a fire, not the large pieces that will burn all night but the smaller stuff that catches quickly and climbs fast, and then the larger pieces once the smaller have established their hold. The fire grows. The light grows with it. Not much light, not the full illumination of an evening fire, but the specific firelight of a building coming back to life, the orange-gold dancing shadows that the Norse world navigated by for the 6 dark months, and that produce, even for a modern viewer encountering them in imagination, a specific quality of warmth that is as much psychological as physical. Astrid moves through the building in the firelight. She goes to the livestock end to check the animals, the nightly check, looking for anything that has changed, an animal off its feed, a goat that seems cold, the horse that occasionally develops a preference for standing in ways that suggest something about his feet that needs attention. Tonight everything is as it should be, which is how most nights are, which is itself the good news, the absence of incident being the form that good fortune takes in winter farming. She fills the water vessel from the storage barrel near the livestock end, the water brought in the evening before and stored inside overnight so it doesn't freeze. She starts the morning porridge. This is not a complicated dish. It is oats and water, cooked in the iron pot that hangs over the fire on the chain that has hung there for 40 years, stirred with the wooden spoon that is so worn with use that its bowl has been reduced to a shallow approximation of its original shape. The porridge will cook slowly over the growing fire, thickening into something that is hot and filling, and that everyone in the building will eat every morning for the next 4 months, because it is what there is, and hot and filling in a Norwegian winter morning is sufficient. Astrid is not bored by the porridge. This is worth not. Because the assumption from a modern distance is that the repetitive diet of winter subsistence farming is experienced as deprivation, as monotony, as something to be endured. The experience from the inside is more complicated than that. The porridge is hot. It is filling. It is reliable. It will be there every morning, produced by the fire and the oats and the water and the time. And the reliability is itself a form of comfort in a world where many things cannot be relied upon. The porridge is not the thing that Astrid would choose to eat forever if she could eat anything, but it is the thing that will get everyone through the morning, every morning, and this function is not unimportant. The building wakes slowly around her. Ragnhild, Gunnar's mother, wakes second, with the light sleeper's early consciousness that 60 years of early mornings have built. She sits up on her sleeping bench. She has her own, at the end nearest the fire, a concession to her age and her status that nobody has ever articulated as a concession, and looks at the fire and at Astrid and asks, in the low voice of the early morning that this household uses before the children are fully awake, whether the wind changed in the night. Astrid says it went south in the small hours, snow by midday. Ragnhild considers this. She says, good, the cold has been too dry. This exchange, brief, practical, calibrated to the exact amount of information needed, is the form that most communication in the Longhouse takes through the winter. The proximity that produces conflict also produces a kind of communicative efficiency, the compression of exchanges that could be longer into the shortest form that carries the necessary content. Because, in a space where everyone can hear everything, the question of what to say and what not to say becomes a constant calculation. Ragnhild gets up and goes to help with the morning. She moves through the building with the specific quality of authority that 61 years in Norse society have given her. She is not the highest status person in this building. Gunnar is. But she is the person with the most accumulated knowledge. And knowledge in this world is a form of status that operates alongside and sometimes above the formal hierarchy. She knows things about this farm, this land, this weather, these animals that nobody else alive knows, because she has been watching them longer than anyone else alive has been watching them. And the things she knows are distributed throughout the daily work in the form of habit and practice that looks like ordinary competence, but is actually the residue of 60 years of paying attention. She knows, for instance, that the gray cow, the older of the two, Brun in Helga's naming system, is going to need extra hay this week because she has been standing near the far wall for the past 3 days, which is what she does when something is wrong that hasn't yet become visibly wrong, the early behavioral signal of an animal that is not quite right. Ragnhild mentions this to Astrid in passing, in the way she mentions most things, not as an announcement, not as a diagnosis, but as information, offered in the same tone as the weather observation, available to be used or not. Astrid adds hay to the morning feeding without comment. Gunnar wakes when the porridge is nearly ready, roused by the smell and by the specific quality of the building's warmth when the fire is properly going. A warmth that is less about temperature than about the change in the air, the reduction of the cold edge that the middle-of-the-night fire low produces, the return of something livable in the atmosphere that the fire maintains. He sits up on the sleeping bench and looks at the fire and listens. He listens for the wind, which tells him about the day. He listens for the animals, which tell him about the night. He listens for anything in the building's sounds that is different from what it should be, the specific attentiveness of a man who is responsible for everything in this building, and who has spent 23 years learning to read its sounds as a doctor reads symptoms. Everything sounds as it should. He gets up. Ulf is already up, which is always the case. Ulf wakes with the building, not with a particular alarm or habit, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who has spent decades sleeping lightly in shared spaces, and for whom sleep is a practical activity rather than an absorption, something done in the available time between the work. He is at the livestock end, already beginning the morning feeding, moving among the animals with the particular ease of someone whose relationship with them is older than anyone else's in the building. He knows each animal individually, knows their habits and their preferences and the specific forms that their particular personalities take, because 40 years of working with animals on this farm have built in him the same kind of knowledge that Ragnhild has about the farm itself, deep, specific, embodied, largely unspoken. He is 58 years old, and he has been a thrall on this farm since he was 16. He was taken in a raid on a settlement to the south, brought here when Gunnar's grandfather was the master of this farm, and in the 42 years since then, he has outlasted 2 masters and a dozen winters that killed other people, and several cattle illnesses, and one very bad summer when the hay was insufficient, and they went into the following winter with stores that were not enough, and he spent the darkest months in a state of quiet, sustained anxiety that he has never fully put down. His formal status is thrall. His actual status is something that the vocabulary available to 9th century Norway doesn't fully capture, not free, technically, but in practice so thoroughly part of this farm, so necessary to its running, so knowledgeable about its specific conditions, that the concept of his being elsewhere is essentially theoretical. He has not been anywhere else in 42 years. He does not particularly want to be anywhere else. This is not contentment exactly, or not only contentment. It is also the specific relationship with place that develops in people who have been somewhere long enough that the place has become part of their identity, regardless of the circumstances that brought them there. He feeds Brun extra hay, as he always does when Brun is standing near the far wall, without reference to whether anyone has noticed and without making a point of it. The morning fills the Longhouse the way mornings in enclosed spaces fill them, gradually, noisily, with the specific energy of people who have been horizontal for 8 hours and are now vertical and negotiating the transition. Eric wakes as if ambushed by consciousness, moving from sleep to full activity in the way that 12-year-olds do, with none of the intermediate stages that adults require. He is off the sleeping bench and in the way of the morning's work before he is fully oriented, and Astrid redirects him to the water-carrying task, which is the winter morning job allocated to him, not because he is the best at it, but because it takes him outside and gives the building 10 minutes of relative peace. He goes outside with the bucket. The cold hits him with the same force it hits everyone when they go from the building's warmth to the Norwegian winter morning, which is the force of something comprehensive and immediate, the air working on every exposed surface of the face simultaneously. He has been outside every morning for weeks. It still hits him. It hits everyone, every time, which is one of the winter's consistent features. The temperature differential between inside and outside never stops being noticeable, never becomes ordinary, remains a fact to be encountered fresh every morning. He goes to the stream. The stream is unfrozen, still running in its bed with the dark sound of water over stones, the surface of it steaming faintly in the cold air, the steam catching the first gray light of the morning. He fills the bucket. He stands for a moment in the cold, which he does every morning and which nobody has told him to do, and which he does because the cold outside, after a night in the Longhouse, is also genuinely pleasant in the specific way that any contrast is pleasant. The relief of cold air after the smoke and the warmth, the specific freshness of a Norwegian winter morning that is itself a kind of beauty if you encounter it in small enough doses. Then he goes back in. The porridge is ready. They eat, all 8 of them, around the fire, in the specific arrangement that the sleeping bench layout and the fire's warmth and the building's routines have produced over the years. Gunnar at one end, Astrid at the other, the children in the middle, Ragnhild on her bench, Ulf and Bjorn at the livestock end of the fire, which is where they eat and have always eaten, not separated from the family by anything explicit, just by the accumulated weight of habit. The porridge is the porridge. It is eaten from wooden bowls with wooden spoons, supplemented this morning by a piece of the smoked fish from the stores, which is dense and salty and tastes of the autumn in which it was made, the specific flavor of fish and smoke and the particular cold of a Norwegian October, which is a taste that everyone in this building has known since childhood, and that contains within it, in the compressed way that tastes contain things, the entire cycle of the year, the catching and the smoking and the storing and the eating. The circle of it, the dependency of this morning's breakfast on decisions made and work done in September when the winter was still theoretical. After eating, the day begins. Gunnar's day in winter is organized around the essential minimum, the animals, the woodpile, the building. The animals must be fed and watered. This is the non-negotiable daily work that the winter requires, the task that cannot be deferred or abbreviated, that is done regardless of weather or mood or the specific tiredness that the long dark produces in everyone. The woodpile must be maintained. Wood used each day must be replaced by wood brought from the stack outside, which is checked daily and assessed against the estimated duration of the remaining winter. The building must be managed, the roof assessed when there is enough light, the walls checked after storms, the small repairs that an old building in a harsh climate continuously requires. He does these things. He does them with the specific competence of a man who has been doing them for 20 years and who has, over those years, reduced the effort required through the accumulation of technique and habit and the identification of the most efficient sequence of operations. The morning rounds of the farm take him approximately 2 hours. He does them alone mostly, or with Ulf alongside when Ulf's presence is useful, which it often is. In the afternoons, the winter work moves inside. The winter is the making season for the Norse farm. The summer is the season of growth and harvest, and all the outdoor labor that the northern climate compresses into its brief warm period. The winter is the season of the hands, the carving, the spinning, the weaving, the repair of the tools and the harness and the boat, the work that requires skill and attention but not the full-body effort of summer, and that fills the long dark hours with something better than idleness. Gunnar carves. He is not a craftsman in the sense of someone who makes things primarily for trade. He is a farmer who carves because it is what there is to do in winter, and because the objects the farm needs are the objects he makes. This winter he is working on a new set of roof boards for the storage building, which are damaged in a way that can be managed but will need addressing before the next summer. The boards are broad and need a specific profile at their edges to interlock correctly, and the carving of them is slow, deliberate work that produces, an hour at a time, the shapes the building requires. He carves by firelight in the afternoons. The firelight is not ideal for this work. It is uneven, it moves, it creates shadows that make the assessment of the work difficult. But the firelight is what there is, and Norse wood carving has been happening by firelight for as long as anyone can remember. And the skill that has developed in this tradition is in part the skill of working accurately in imperfect light, which is one of those competencies that looks like magic from the outside, and that is, from the inside, just what you learn to do because it is the condition you work in. Leif carves beside him. This is not a formal instruction. Gunnar has not set up a teaching session. Leif sits near his father in the afternoons with his own work, and the proximity and the occasional comment and the visible example of his father's technique constitute the transmission of skill that the Norse tradition uses, which is the transmission through doing alongside rather than through explicit instruction. Leif absorbs what he absorbs. He asks questions when he has them. Gunnar answers when an answer is useful. Between them in these long winter afternoons, something passes that is not carving, not entirely. The carving is the form. What passes through the form is something else, the specific quality of relationship between a man and his son in the slow hours of winter, the absence of the rushed efficiency of summer when there is always too much to do, and the presence of time, long, slow hours of time that allow a different kind of attention to develop. Gunnar talks sometimes in the afternoons, not about the carving, about the farm, about the land, about the decisions that have shaped the place and the reasons behind them. He talks about his father, who made the decisions that are now structures, the birch trees, the storage pit placement, the particular routing of the path from the house to the stream that avoids the wettest ground. He talks about the voyage to the west, the one that produced the scar, in a version that contains more of what actually happened than the version he tells to larger audiences. Leif listens. He is 15 and he is restless and he wants to leave, and he knows it, and he thinks his father doesn't know it, but his father does know it. Because Gunnar was 15 once and was also restless and also wanted to leave, and he left twice and came back and is here, and the birch trees are here. And in the long winter afternoons by the fire with the carving in his hands he is trying to give Leif something that the leaving won't give him, something about the place, about the staying, about what it means to be the person who is here when everyone else has gone somewhere more interesting. He doesn't say this directly. He carves. Leif carves. Beside him. The fire burns. Astrid through the winter afternoon spins. The spinning wheel turns with a rhythm that is the Longhouse's afternoon sound, the soft whirring of the spindle, and the regular motion of Astrid's hands drawing the wool from the distaff into the thread that will become, eventually, the cloth that the farm wears and uses and trades. She has been spinning since she was 5 years old. The rhythm of it is as natural to her as breathing, and she can maintain it through conversation and through the management of the children, and through the occasional crises that the winter produces without losing the quality of the thread, which requires a consistent tension that is felt in the hands rather than measured by any external standard. She thinks while she spins. This is one of the things that the history of women's work rarely captures, the quality of the thought that happens in the hands-occupied mind-free state that certain kinds of sustained craft produce. Astrid's spinning time is her thinking time, the hours when the practical management of the farm moves through her mind with the same systematic attention she would give it if she were making decisions at a table, except that she is making thread at a fire. She thinks about the stores. It is November. The assessment she made in October, when the stores were full and the winter was beginning, was that they had enough for a normal winter, with margin for a hard one. November has been hard, a cold hard that has the quality of a winter that is settling in for the long stay rather than the quick cold that sometimes comes early and passes. She recalculates as she spins, with the numbers that she carries in her head rather than on paper, because there is no paper and there is no accounting system that she was taught, only the accumulated practice of household management that has given her the specific numerical intuition of a woman who has been feeding 8 people through Norwegian winters for 17 years. The calculation is not alarming, but it is attentive. She will need to adjust the daily portions of the dried fish, slightly, from December. Not so much that anyone suffers, enough that the stores last through the end of February without requiring the autumn's hedging margin to be used as main supply rather than backup. She will not announce this adjustment. She will simply make it, in the way that most of the farm's management happens, invisibly in the gap between the decision and the outcome, with the decision itself never directly visible. Gunnar trusts this completely. He does not participate in it, not because he couldn't but because he doesn't need to. The store's management is Astrid's domain, established over 17 years of accurate management, and the accuracy of her management is the argument for leaving it in her domain. This is how the farm functions. Each person's competence in their domain is the basis for the trust placed in that competence, and the trust placed in the competence is the basis for the functioning of the whole, which is a system that works until a competence fails, and in 17 years Astrid's has not failed. Ragnhild in the afternoons tells stories. This is her function in the winter, or one of them, the formal function, the one that the household needs and that she is best positioned to provide. She is 61 years old and she has been listening to and telling stories since before anyone else in this building was born. And the stories she tells are the stories that the Norse tradition carries in the oral memory of its people. The myths, the histories, the genealogies, the accounts of ancestors and their deeds, and the judgments that the gods made about those deeds, the entire framework of the Norse worldview embedded in narrative and transmitted in the long winter evenings when there is nothing to do but listen. She tells the stories to the children primarily, though everyone listens. She tells them in the particular voice of the practiced oral narrator, which is not a performance voice but a telling voice, quieter than a performance, more sustained than conversation, with a rhythm that is part speech and part incantation. The cadences of the stories so deeply embedded in the tradition that they carry their own momentum, pulling the listener forward without the listener quite knowing how. The children listen. Helga listens with her whole body, curled at Ragnhild's feet with her eyes wide, and her attention total in the way that small children give total attention to stories when the stories are good. She doesn't understand everything. The theology is sometimes above her, the genealogy's confusing, the moral calculus of the sagas opaque. But she understands the shape of things, the feeling of the stories, the texture of the world they describe, and the understanding she builds is the understanding of someone laying a foundation that later knowledge will build on. Leif listens differently, with the critical attention of someone who is checking the stories against something, testing them against his own developing sense of how the world works, the 15-year-old's encounter with received tradition, which is always in part an argument with it. Eric listens in fragments, between his own restlessness and the tasks that the afternoon produces, catching the stories in pieces that he assembles imperfectly into a narrative that is partly Ragnhild's and partly his own invention, which is a reasonable method and probably how the stories developed in the first place. Sigrid listens with the specific complicated attention of someone who is both fully engaged and slightly resistant, because the stories contain, among other things, extensive material about the roles of women in the Norse world, and Sigrid has been developing opinions about this material for 3 years with the same conviction she brings to everything. She says, one afternoon in November, after a story that has involved a woman being primarily a prize. But why couldn't she just go herself? Ragnhild looks at her for a moment. She says she could, some did. She says, "Shall I tell you about one who did?" And the afternoon changes register, from the standard repertoire to the specific, from the broadly shared tradition to the story that Ragnhild has been keeping for the right moment, which is now, which is this 17-year-old granddaughter who has opinions and needs stories that contain the possibilities she hasn't been shown yet. She tells the story. It is a story about a woman named Gudrid, who is historical, whose life is documented in the sagas, who sailed west with Leif Erikson and further still, to the coast of North America, and who had children there and managed the settlement there, and whose grasp of the world was not limited to a single fjord but extended, literally and imaginatively, to the edge of the known world and slightly beyond it. Sigrid listens. The fire burns. Outside, the wind has shifted as Astrid predicted, and the snow is beginning. Let me take you now through the deeper part of the winter, the part they call the dark time, the weeks around the solstice when the sun barely clears the horizon even at midday, when the fjord is frozen, and the world outside the Longhouse is locked in a silence so complete that the building's interior sounds seem louder by contrast, when the night is 18 hours long, and the day is the gray memory of day, a brief pale gesture at the horizon that retreats before it fully arrives. This is the hardest part. Not because of cold or hunger the stores are holding, the fire is holding, the cold is manageable. It is hardest because of the dark, which does something to the mind that the body does not do, which is cumulative and specific and does not respond to practical management the way that cold and hunger do. The dark builds. By December it has been dark for 2 months, the shortening days arriving so gradually that the loss of each individual day's light is imperceptible. But the accumulation of losses is very much perceptible, is felt in the quality of the afternoon when the light goes before the work is done, is felt in the mornings when the fire is the first light, and the sun's arrival, when it comes, is so modest that it barely registers as different from firelight. The people in the Longhouse manage this differently. Gunnar manages it by refusing to manage it, by treating the dark as simply another condition of the winter, like the cold, requiring adjustment of behavior but not particular attention. He sleeps more than in summer, which is the physiological response to reduced light, and which he allows rather than fighting, and he works by firelight in the hours that summer would call afternoon and the dark calls evening, and he does not give the dark more significance than the temperature or the wind. Astrid manages it through the work, which continues to exist and to require attention regardless of the light, and through the specific maintenance of the household's daily rhythms, the meals at the same times, the morning check of the animals, the evening spindle, which are a form of structure that the dark tests and that she maintains as a kind of argument with the dark, the argument that the day exists and has its shape regardless of whether the sun participates. Ragnhild manages it through the stories and through the specific quality of old age in this world, which has made its peace with darkness in a way that youth has not. She has been through enough winters to understand that this particular darkness ends, as all the others ended, and the understanding is embodied in her in a way that makes the dark less large than it is to the young. Leif does not manage it well. This is not a failure of character. He is 15 and he has been inside for 2 months, and the restlessness that the summer's activity keeps at a manageable leave. El has, in the darkness and confinement of the deep winter, intensified to something that is almost physical, a tightness in him that the carving and the listening and the work cannot fully address. He gets up at odd hours and stands near the doorway breathing the cold air from outside the building. He picks fights with Eric over nothing, which produces responses from Gunnar that are measured and firm, and that Leif accepts without comment because Gunnar is right and Leif knows it. He carves with greater intensity. The object he is making this December is a ship. Not a real ship, a carved model, maybe 30 centimeters long, worked from a single piece of oak that he found in the woodpile, a piece too small for practical use but large enough for this. He is making it with the obsessive detail of someone who is making it as a promise to himself, the ship's lines as precise as he can make them, the strakes individually carved, the prow with its specific forward lean, the details of the deck arrangement. He has never been on a proper longship, but he has seen them, and the seeing has been absorbed in the specific way that things you want intensely are absorbed, completely, accurately, in every particular. He works on the ship by firelight in the evenings. Gunnar watches him work. He does not say anything about the ship for a long time. He says nothing about the fact that Leif is making a ship rather than the useful objects that the winter craft hours are supposed to produce. He lets the ship develop under Leif's hands through the long dark December evenings, and he watches with the specific quality of attention of a man who is watching something he has been watching for several years, and is now, in the ship, seeing clearly expressed. One evening in December when the ship is nearly finished, he says to Leif, "It's a good ship." Leif says nothing, but the quality of his stillness for a moment says, "I know, and you know." Gunnar says, "Your great-uncle Thorvald left when he was 17. He came back at 32. Leif says, "Where did he go?" Gunnar says, "Everywhere he could find. Then he came back." He picks up his own carving. The boards progress under his hands. He says, "You should finish the ship." The solstice arrives. It arrives not as an event. There is no moment of visible change, no dramatic reversal of the dark, but as a fact, a point on the calendar, the shortest day, the turning of the year. In the Norse world it is marked with Yule, the great midwinter celebration that the Christian tradition will eventually absorb and rename, but that in this century is still primarily what it is, which is a marking of the midwinter, a gathering against the dark, a feast and a fire, and a series of rituals that the tradition maintains as the specific medicine for the deep winter. Gunnar slaughters one of the goats. This is the Yule feast in practical terms. The midwinter kill, the opening of the stores, the eating of something fresh and good in the middle of the months of dried and preserved. The goat is butchered with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times, the preparation organized by Astrid with the care of someone who has been thinking about this meal for weeks, and the cooking is Astrid's best winter work. The goat roasted over the fire that is built larger than usual on this night, the smell filling the building with something that cuts through the smoke and the animal smells, and the cold and produces, in the people around the fire, the specific response of the body to the smell of good food being properly cooked. They eat, the whole household together, on the longest night of the year, with the fire the largest it has been since October and the food the best since then, and the eating not the quiet, efficient fueling of a regular morning but something else, something that takes longer and involves more talking and the specific loosening that good food and a large fire produce. Ragnhild tells the Yule stories. These are different from the evening stories, longer, more formal, the stories that belong specifically to this night, the stories about the gods and the world and the meaning of the turning of the year, the mythology that the Norse tradition uses to frame the solstice in a narrative that gives the dark winter a place in the larger story of the cosmos. She tells the story of the world tree, Yggdrasil, whose roots reach into the underworld and whose branches hold the 9 worlds. She tells the story of Odin hanging on the tree for 9 days to learn the wisdom of the runes. She tells the story of the sun and the moon being chased across the sky by wolves that will one day, at the end of time, catch them, and the darkness that will follow. Helga listens with her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open. Eric is awake for the first story and asleep by the second, and Astrid carries him to the sleeping bench without interrupting the story, which continues over his absence. Bjorn, the young man from the south who has been on the farm for 2 years, and who sits through these Yule evenings with the polite attentiveness of someone whose relationship to the tradition is that of an interested guest rather than a native, is more engaged than usual this year, drawn in by the quality of Ragnhild's telling, which has something in the Yule stories that is not in the evening stories, a depth of conviction that makes them feel like accounts rather than narratives, like things that are true rather than things that are told. He will carry some of these stories with him when he eventually leaves. He doesn't know this yet, but the stories are in him now, working their way into the fabric of who he is in the way that stories do when they are told well enough, and you are open enough to receive them. The fire burns. The night is the longest night. And then, almost imperceptibly, the days begin to lengthen. It is not noticeable immediately. The first days after the solstice feel the same as the days before it, the same quality of gray light, the same duration of darkness, the same fire-dependent existence. The change is happening, but it is happening in increments too small to perceive directly. A few minutes of light added each day, the calendar knowing what the eye cannot yet see. But the calendar is believed, and belief is its own form of knowledge. Astrid knows it from the solstice calculation that she maintains without ever writing it down, the mental count of days that her mother taught her and her mother before that, the specific knowledge of where you are in the wheel of the year that the farm requires, because the farm must be ready when the wheel turns, and readiness requires anticipation. She says on the morning after the solstice, the days are getting longer now. She says it to no one in particular, or to the building, or to the fire, and the building receives it in the way that it receives everything. The smoke-darkened walls absorbing the words the way they absorb everything else that has been said in this space for 40 years. The days are getting longer. It is not yet true in any way that the eye can confirm. But it is true in the only way that matters, which is that the direction has reversed, and what reverses will eventually arrive. And the arriving of the light is as certain as the arriving of the dark was certain in October. And this certainty is itself the medicine, the specific medicine that the Norse tradition has developed for the deep winter, which is not warmth or light or food but knowledge. The knowledge of the year's pattern, held in memory and transmitted through generations. The knowledge that this particular dark has a specific and approaching end. Ragnhild, hearing Astrid, nods. She does not say anything. The nod is sufficient. Let me move you through the remaining winter quickly, because the remaining winter is, in large part, the same winter you have already been through. The same fire, the same porridge, the same spinning and carving and stories and negotiations with the cold and the dark and the confinement. What changes in the weeks after the solstice is not the conditions but the character of the conditions, the way the same cold and dark have a different quality when they are receding rather than advancing, the way endurance feels different when it is the last of the difficult thing rather than the middle of it. Brunn recovers. Whatever was wrong with her in November resolves over December, the extra hay perhaps part of it or perhaps not, the specific body chemistry of the cow doing what it did regardless of the intervention. And by January she is standing at the water trough instead of the far wall, and her milk production, which had decreased, normalizes. Ragnhild notices this and says nothing, which is how she marks most things that go right. Leif finishes the ship in February. He holds it up to the firelight and looks at it for a long time. Then he puts it on the shelf above the sleeping bench where his parents keep the things that are kept, the few metal objects, the small items of value, the things that have been on that shelf for as long as anyone can remember. He puts the ship on the shelf among them and goes back to his other work. Gunnar sees it there and says nothing. In March, the first change in the quality of the light becomes perceptible. It is not warmth. The cold in March is still serious, still lethal without adequate preparation, still capable of killing a person or an animal who is not paying attention. But the light is different. The sun clears the ridge to the south with a clarity that February's sun didn't have, and the hours between its appearance and its disappearance have increased to the point where the afternoon now contains actual light, rather than just the absence of dark. And the quality of the air when Gunnar goes outside for the morning rounds is the quality of air that has been exposed to direct sunlight, rather than the gray-filtered quality of the deep winter. He stands outside one morning in March with the sun on his face. It is the first time the sun has been on his face with any strength since October. He stands there for a moment with his eyes closed, and the specific sensation of sunlight on skin after 5 months without it. The warmth that is distinct from the fire's warmth, different in quality, more direct, something about its directness that operates below the threshold of ordinary sensation and produces something in the body that is not exactly pleasure but is adjacent to it, the response of an organism that has been without something it needs and is now receiving it. He opens his eyes. The fjord is still frozen. The birch trees are still bare. The snow is still on the ground and will be for another month at least. The winter is not over. But the sun is on his face. He goes back inside. The preparations for spring begin in April, in the specific overlap between the end of one season and the beginning of the next that is one of the characteristic features of the farming year. The winter not yet finished, and the spring work already starting, the two seasons running simultaneously for a few weeks before the winter releases its hold fully. The animals go outside for the first time in 6 months. This is an event. Helga has been anticipating it for weeks, in the way that she has been told it will happen and can imagine it but cannot quite believe it until it happens. The animals, which have been the indoor companions of the entire winter, walking out through the door of the Longhouse into the pale spring light, and the cold air and the world outside the building, which they have not seen since October. The cows go first. They go with the specific combination of caution and purpose that large animals show when encountering an unfamiliar or long unvisited space. The pause at the door, the assessment, the cautious step, and then, once the assessment is complete, the complete and wholehearted commitment to being outside, because outside has grass or the possibility of grass, and the possibility of grass is motivation enough. Brunn walks out into the morning. Helga watches from the doorway. She watches Brunn walk across the yard and lower her head to the ground and smell the earth, which is still cold and mostly frozen, but which has the specific quality of earth that is starting to remember what it is. The first hint of the organic fermentation that the warming will produce, the smell of spring beginning underground before it has expressed itself above it. Brunn sniffs the ground. She lifts her head and looks at the fjord, which is beginning to break up at the edges, the ice cracking in the morning sun and refreezing at night in a cycle that will continue for another few weeks before the fjord is fully open. She looks at the birch trees, which are not yet in leaf but have the specific quality of birch trees in April, the buds visible on the branches themselves having a color that is slightly warmer than winter birch, a hint of the green that is coming. She lows once. It is a sound that Helga has heard every day for 6 months inside the building, where it had a muffled, indoor quality. Outside, in the morning air, it has a different sound entirely, cleaner, rounder, filling the space of the yard and going up into the open sky above without any walls to contain it. Helga laughs. She is 6 years old and it is spring and the cow is outside, and the sound of the cow outside is the funniest and most delightful thing she has encountered in recent memory, and her laugh goes up into the same open sky, and Astrid, who is behind her in the doorway, hears it, and something in her that has been held tight since October releases slightly. The winter is over. Not quite, not officially. There are cold nights ahead and late frosts and the mud season that follows the thaw and the hard work of the spring planting that is still weeks away. The winter is not over in the practical sense. But Helga's laugh in the morning air is something that feels like the winter being over, and in the human calendar this feeling is as real as the calendar itself, and more immediate. Ulf, moving through the yard with the morning's tasks, pauses when he hears the laugh. He looks at Helga and at Brunn and at the birch trees on the slope above the house. He has seen this transition 42 times, the moment when the animals go outside and the winter breaks. He is 58 years old and he has spent 42 of those years on this farm, and this morning is the same morning it has always been. He goes on with his work. But for a moment, the specific moment in which Helga laughed and Brunn lowed, and the sound went up into the open sky, he was present to it in a way that he has been present to it every year, the way you are present to things when they are the same things your entire life, and the repetition has made them rich rather than diminished, has added layer upon layer of meaning to each successive instance rather than worn the meaning away. He is glad it is spring. He is always glad it is spring. The gladness is the same gladness it has been for 42 years, which is to say it is exactly the right amount of gladness, neither more nor less. The gladness of a man who has come through another winter in the specific, non-dramatic way that most winters are come through, day by day, fire by fire, bowl of porridge by bowl of porridge. He is glad. Now let me go back into the Longhouse, to the middle of the winter, and show you some of the things I have moved past too quickly. The specific texture of the days and nights and the small events that fill them. The details that the sagas don't record because they are too ordinary, and that I want to give you because they are the most real parts of the story. There is the issue of the smoke. I mentioned the smoke earlier, the fire in the central hearth, the opening in the roof, the theoretical upward draft that is supposed to carry the smoke out of the building. The theory is correct. The practice is more complicated, because the draft depends on the wind direction and the wind direction changes. And when the wind is from certain directions, the draft reverses, and the smoke, instead of going up through the hole in the roof, comes down and fills the building with a density that makes the eyes water and the throat ache and produces, in everyone in the building, the specific resigned tolerance of people who have been dealing with this for decades and know it will clear eventually. It always clears eventually. But in the winter of this particular year, there is a week in December when the wind is persistently from the south, which is the wrong direction for the Longhouse's roof design, and the smoke situation is bad enough that Gunnar and Ulf spend an afternoon making modifications to the roof opening, adjustments to the baffles that are supposed to manage this, using materials from the stored building supplies. That improved the situation somewhat and address the immediate problem while leaving intact the fundamental issue, which is that the roof hole design was made for the prevailing wind direction, and the prevailing wind this week is not prevailing. Ragnhild says, in the way she says most things, the smoke is worse this year. Astrid says, the wind is wrong. Ragnhild says, it was wrong in 63 too, that was a bad winter. Astrid says, was it? Ragnhild says, Gunnar's father lost 2 goats in 63, too cold in the livestock end. We moved the partition. Astrid considers this. She checks the temperature in the livestock end more carefully for the next week. She adds bedding for the goats. 2 goats survive the winter. This is how knowledge moves in the Longhouse. In conversation, in the specific form of the older person's observation offered to the younger person's practical management, each piece of information useful only if it connects to a decision, and the connection happening or not depending on whether the right person is listening at the right moment. The knowledge that Ragnhild carries, the accumulated practical wisdom of 60 winters, is not written down. It cannot be written down. It exists in her memory, and in the memories of the people she has talked to over the years, and when she dies it will be partly lost and partly transmitted, the transmitted parts carried forward in the practice of the people who heard her at the right moment and made the connection. This is how most knowledge has always moved, in most of human history. The writing down is recent, the remembering is ancient. There is also the issue of the fjord. The fjord freezes in November, usually, and in a normal year it is frozen solid by December and stays that way until March. This year it freezes early, in late October, which Gunnar notes with the attention he gives all unusual weather, filing it in the category of things that might mean something or might not. The frozen fjord changes the character of the winter in specific ways. It removes the boat as an option, which in summer is the fastest way to reach the neighboring farms and the market town, and replaces it with the overland route, which in winter and over frozen ground and snow is slower and more difficult. This means fewer contacts with the outside world, fewer exchanges of news and goods, and the social contact that counteracts the winter's isolation. It means that the Longhouse's social world becomes smaller, the circle of regular contact reduced to the immediate farm and the neighboring farms that are close enough to reach on foot in a day. But it also adds the ice. The frozen fjord in winter is a surface, and a surface is an opportunity, and the Norse relationship with ice. The skates made from bone, the knowledge of ice conditions, the specific reading of frozen water for thickness and reliability, is a practical skill that the winter adds to the farm's available modes of movement. Gunnar uses the ice to check on the two neighboring farms that are across the fjord and that in summer require a full-day boat trip to visit. In winter, with the ice solid, the crossing is 40 minutes. He goes across in December once to check on a family he has been concerned about, older neighbors. The man of the farm ill in the autumn in a way that Gunnar noted and has been thinking about. The farm's situation uncertain. He takes Leif with him. The crossing of the frozen fjord is one of the things that Leif will remember. Not because anything dramatic happens, the ice is solid, the crossing is uneventful, the visit to the neighboring farm is useful, and the family is managing. The man recovered enough to be on his feet and planning for spring. The crossing is memorable for the quality of the experience. The fjord as a surface rather than water, the strange silence of it, the specific sound of their feet on the ice that is unlike any other sound, the view from the middle of the fjord looking back at the Longhouse on its slope above the shore, small in the distance, smoke from the roof opening rising straight up in the still cold air. This is the Longhouse from the outside. From the middle of the frozen fjord, looking back, it is small. It has always seemed large from the inside, the 30 meters of its length filling the entire available world on the winter evenings, the walls closing in on the dark, the fire the center of everything. From the middle of the fjord, it is a small building on a small slope in a large landscape of rock and ice and water, and the smoke from its roof is the only sign of life for a kilometer in any direction. Leif looks at it. He will leave this place. He knows it now with a certainty he didn't have before, or rather with a certainty that has crystallized from the previous year's gradual accumulation of knowing. He will leave and go somewhere, and the somewhere is not yet defined and may not be for years, but the leaving is certain. He looks at the Longhouse from the middle of the frozen fjord and he feels, alongside the certainty of leaving, something else, the specific quality of feeling for a place that you know you will leave, the heightened attention that the knowledge of departure brings, the way things become more visible when you are in the process of saying goodbye to them, even when the goodbye is still months or years away. The Longhouse smoke rises straight up in the still air. He will remember this. Gunnar, beside him, is not thinking about the Longhouse. He is thinking about the neighboring farm and the man's recovery, and the assessment of whether the family will make it through the winter without the assistance that he came to offer, and that they declined with the specific dignified refusal of people who are proud, and not yet desperate enough to accept what they need. He thinks about this all the way back across the ice. He will go again in February, he decides. By February, the calculation may have changed. He goes back in February. By February, it has changed. He brings a measure of stored grain and a portion of the dried fish, delivered in the way that help is delivered between neighbors in this world, as a practical exchange, a loan against the spring surplus, a transaction that allows the receiving family to accept without the weight of charity, which the Norse tradition has no comfortable category for. They accept. He comes home. The winter continues. Now let me tell you about the evenings. The evenings in the Longhouse are, in some ways, the most fully human part of the winter, the time when the practical work of the day is done, and the space that is left is filled with the things that humans fill it with when the immediate tasks release them. The stories, the music, the games, the conversation, the specific and irreplaceable sociability of people who have been together long enough to have a shared history, and who fill the winter evenings with the performance and the re-performance of that history. Bjorn plays a stringed instrument. He has been playing it since before he arrived on this farm, an instrument he made himself in the winter before last, a simple plucked thing with 5 strings whose sound in the Longhouse evenings is the sound that the evenings need, not a complicated sound, not a virtuosic sound, but a warm and present sound that fills the space between the voices and the fire without demanding that anything stop to accommodate it. He plays mostly in the evenings, when the work is done and the fire is high, and the building has reached whatever approximation of comfort it reaches by the hour after the evening meal. He plays the tunes that he knows, some from his home place to the south, some learned here, some found in the gap between learned tunes and personal variation where a player makes something that is partly other people's and partly his own. Sigrid listens. She listens the way she listens to the stories, with the specific combination of full engagement and careful resistance that has become her characteristic mode of receiving things. She has been listening to Bjorn play for 2 winters, and she has developed opinions about his playing, which she has shared with him in the specific form that opinions between people who are attracted to each other and not sure what to do about it take, as constructive criticism, as the engagement that is not the engagement it looks like, as conversation that is about music on the surface and about something else below it. Bjorn has received this correctly, which is to say he has received the criticism as what it is and the conversation as what it is, and the navigation of both simultaneously has been one of the more interesting challenges of his 2 years on this farm. He is 20 years old. He is a long way from home. He is here for reasons that he has been gradually understanding over 2 winters, reasons that have to do with something that went wrong in the South, that he does not discuss, that the farm has not asked about, which is the specific hospitality of a place that takes a person's work and does not require their history. He plays. In January, on an evening when the fire is good and the wind is from the north, and the smoke draws perfectly for once, and the building has the specific quality of enclosed warmth that it achieves on these rare perfect evenings, warm and clear and full of firelight, with no competing cold from any direction. Ragnhild asks him to play the tune he played in October when he first arrived on the farm. He plays it. It is a simple tune, repetitive in the way that the best folk tunes are repetitive, returning to the same phrase each time with the same quality of return that a river has coming back to the same bend, familiar and different, the same shape inhabited by different water. He plays it twice through, and the building listens, all 8 people and their animals, in the specific quality of attention that music produces in an enclosed winter space, the attention that is not effort but surrender, the body and the mind yielding to the rhythm and the melody and being carried. Gunnar, listening, thinks about nothing specific. His mind is in the music the way it is in the fire on the evenings when the fire is good, not analyzing, not planning, simply present in the warmth and the light and the sound, which is as close to rest as a man responsible for 8 people and a farm ever fully gets. Astrid, listening, stops spinning. She almost never stops spinning during the evenings. The spindle is the evening's constant, the thread building while everything else builds around it. But she stops, for the duration of the tune, and lets the tune play without the accompaniment of the spindle's motion. And in the stopping is a quality of surrender that she allows herself very rarely, the surrender to the present moment without any of the future in it. Helga falls asleep. Eric, who has been carving something with his knife and Leif's supervision, stops carving and listens with the unguarded openness of a 12-year-old who does not yet know that listening to music is something you are supposed to have a position on. Leif listens and thinks about the ship on the shelf. Ragnhild closes her eyes. Bjorn plays. The tune comes back to its phrase again and returns from it and comes back once more and then ends, the last note hanging in the smoky air of the Longhouse for a moment before the fire crackles and the spell breaks, and the evening becomes the ordinary evening again, the work resuming and the conversations resuming, and the building resuming the specific business of being a building full of people in the middle of a winter. But for the duration of the tune, something happened. What happened is difficult to name, and the Norse tradition would name it differently than we might, would name it in terms of the experience of the present as a gift, the moment of being entirely here, which the tradition values in ways that its reputation for forward-hurtling action and glory-seeking sometimes obscures. The Norse tradition also values stillness, also values the winter evening by the fire, also knows that the pause in the middle of the effort is part of what the effort is for. The tune is the pause. The pause is the thing. Let me take you outside now, briefly, into the winter night, because the outside of the Longhouse at night is as important to understand as the inside, and because the contrast between them is one of the defining experiences of the winter, a contrast so comprehensive and so immediate that it shapes the entire meaning of the inside. The night outside the Longhouse in the deep winter of a Norwegian fjord is the most complete darkness that most modern people have never encountered. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, which contains the shapes of familiar things and the ambient glow from outside and the residual light of the eyes adjusting. The darkness outside the Longhouse at midnight in January is the darkness of no ambient light source in any direction, of a sky that is either fully overcast and therefore lightless or fully clear and therefore star-filled, with nothing between those states and nothing gentle about either of them. When the sky is clear, it is the sky that David saw from the caravanserai courtyard in Merv, the sky that Havard saw from his harbor in Norway, the full northern sky without light competition, the Milky Way not a suggestion but a fact, the stars not points but presences, the darkness between them the minority rather than the majority. It is a sky that, if you walk out of the Longhouse at midnight in January and look up, produces something that is not quite awe and not quite fear, but is in the register of both, the specific response of a human being to something very large that does not require them. When the sky is overcast, the dark is complete and featureless, and the cold is a physical presence rather than a condition, a density in the air that the body encounters rather than simply experiences. Gunnar goes outside at night. Not for any reason that he would articulate as a reason, not for the view, not for reflection, not for the deliberate experience of the dark. He goes outside because the Longhouse in the winter's middle accumulates a specific quality of pressure, the 8 people and the animals and the smoke and the noise and the 6 months of shared space, that occasionally requires the relief of the outside, the brief encounter with the cold and the silence and the dark that resets something, that makes the return to the warmth possible with a gratitude that the warmth alone cannot produce. He stands outside for 5 minutes, sometimes 10. Then he goes back in. He never says anything about these excursions. Nobody asks. The building understands that Gunnar occasionally needs to be outside for 10 minutes, the way it understands all the things about all 8 people that constitute the specific knowledge of a shared space over time. The building knows its people. This is one of the stranger things about the Longhouse winter. The building itself begins to feel like a participant, the walls having absorbed so much of the life that happens within them that they seem to have a character, a presence, a specific quality of being this building, and not any other. The sounds of the timber frame shifting under the snow's weight, the specific creak of the third board from the livestock end that always creaks when the temperature drops below a certain point, the particular warmth that collects in the corner behind the sleeping bench where the turf wall is thickest. These are not features of a building but characteristics, the specific identity of a structure that has been lived in for 40 years, and that carries that living in its materials. Ragnhild knows this building better than anyone. She was here when Gunnar's father was alive. She was here when Gunnar's children were born. She has been in this building for 30 years, longer than anyone except Ulf, and the building is more familiar to her than any person alive, more constant than any relationship, more reliable in its specific qualities than any other thing she has. She is, in a way that she has never articulated, grateful to it. Not grateful in the way you are grateful to a person, not with the full weight of obligation and response that human gratitude carries. Grateful in the way you are grateful to a thing that has served you, the specific warmth of appreciation for something that has done its work well and kept you alive through 30 winters and that will, when she is gone, continue to do this for whoever comes after. She is 61 years old and she knows things that nobody else in this building knows, and she is in the process, not consciously, not deliberately, of distributing those things through the conversations of the winter, the comments and observations and stories that she places in the evenings like seeds, knowing that some of them will grow in the people who receive them and some will not, and that the ones that grow will carry something of her forward in the only way that she has ever been interested in being carried forward, which is through use. Not through memory, through use. The thing that someone learns from her and applies in a November morning 40 years from now, the extra hay for Brunn, the partition moved for the goats, the specific angle of the roof baffle in a south wind, that is the form she will continue to exist in when she is gone. She is not troubled by this. She has made her peace with it over 60 years. She tells her stories. She offers her observations. She trusts the building to hold what it has always held, and the people in it to carry what they will carry, and the spring to come when it comes. Outside, the winter night continues. Inside, the fire burns. Now let me bring you to the very end of the winter, to the morning in April when the fjord finally breaks, when the ice gives way to the sound that the Norse called the voice of the fjord, the deep, structural sound of ice releasing its hold on the water beneath it, spreading across the surface in cracks that travel faster than a running person, the ice fragmenting and grinding in the morning light until the water is clear again and the fjord is itself again, moving, present, cold, alive. Gunnar hears it from the building. He has been waiting for this sound for months, not consciously, not with anticipation that he names as anticipation, but with the specific attentiveness that the farm's manager gives to the approach of the season that makes the next year's work possible. The fjord unfreezing is the beginning of everything, the access to the wider world, the possibility of trade, the opening of the maritime routes that summer will use. It is the end of the closed winter and the beginning of the open year. He goes to the door and looks out. The fjord is moving. The ice is still there in fragments, floating and colliding in the current that the released water generates, but the water itself is visible, dark and cold between the ice pieces, moving with the specific purposeful motion of water that has been held still for months and is now doing what water does, which is moving. He stands in the doorway for a long time. The family comes, one by one, to stand beside him or to look past him, Astrid first, then Leif, who looks at the fjord with an expression that says, "Yes, this is the thing I was waiting for." Then Eric, who runs past everyone and out onto the ice-free shore and throws a piece of ice into the water with the specific satisfaction of a 12-year-old expressing something physical that cannot be expressed any other way. Then Helga, who takes Astrid's hand and watches the ice fragments collide. Ragnhild comes last. She stands behind everyone, not pushing forward, content to see it from where she is, the fjord visible over Gunnar's shoulder and Leif's and Astrid's, the winter's end visible in the moving water. She has seen this 42 times. Or something like 42. She has been counting winters since she was old enough to count, and the count is not precise at the far end, the earliest winters blurring into a time before counting. But she has seen this many times, and each time it is this, the same water in the same fjord making the same sound and the same movement, and producing the same quality of relief in the people watching it. The same relief every time. She stands in the doorway of the Longhouse and watches the spring arrive and feels the specific feeling of it, which is not joy exactly and not relief exactly, but something that contains both and is larger than either. The feeling of the body and the mind registering the return of possibility, the end of the long, hard, closed time, the opening of the world. Ulf is in the yard already, beginning the spring work, the work that the farm requires from the first day the ground permits it, and that Ulf begins as he begins everything, without announcement, with complete competence, as if the work has simply always been being done and he is simply continuing it. He looks at the fjord once. Then he goes back to work. The spring is here, the work is here, the two things are the same thing. Let me tell you now what this winter was. Not what happened in it, which I have been telling you, but what it was, what the Longhouse winter means in the larger account of what human beings have done and are and will be. The Norse Longhouse in winter was one of the most extreme experiments in communal living that agricultural civilization has ever run. 8 people, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, sharing 30 meters of enclosed space with their animals for 6 months, with minimal privacy, minimal alone time, minimal contact with the outside world, in conditions of cold and dark and smoke that would qualify as hardship by any subsequent standard. They ran this experiment continuously, generation after generation, on the same farms, in the same buildings, for centuries, and they not only survived it but produced from it one of the most remarkable cultures in European history. The Norse culture that explored the North Atlantic, that settled Iceland and Greenland and reached North America 500 years before Columbus, that produced the sagas and the legal traditions and the craftsmanship and the specific qualities of character. The hardness, the humor, the acceptance of difficulty, the capacity for the long endurance that the winter Longhouse built in the people who lived through it. The winter built them, not the summer, when the world was open and the work was outdoor in the op. Tians were many and the social life was rich. The winter, the closed, dark, smoke-filled, animal-smelling, 8 people 30 meters winter, that is where the culture that produced the sagas and the voyages was made, in the specific pressure of the long months where there was nothing to do but endure, and in the endurance develop. What the endurance developed was not only hardness. It developed the specific qualities that the Longhouse required, the tolerance for proximity, the skill at managing conflict before it became destructive, the value placed on the person who was useful in an enclosed space, Fatima's equivalent, the cook, the healer, the storyteller, the one who made the inside livable, the understanding that winter was not an interruption of life, but the form that life took for half the year, and that the life lived in winter was fully life, not the pause between lives. The evenings were fully life. The porridge was fully life. Ragnhild's stories and Bjorn's music and Leif's ship on the shelf and Helga's names for the goats and Ulf's early mornings, and Astrid's spinning and Gunnar's 10 minutes outside in the dark. Fully life. All of it. The small texture of a life lived inside a long winter in a building on a Norwegian fjord 1,000 years ago. And here you are. You are warm in your bed or your chair or wherever you have found the comfortable position for the night, and outside your window is whatever outside you have, perhaps also cold, perhaps also dark, perhaps not a Norwegian fjord but a city street or a suburb or a field or a distant mountain range. Whatever version of outside your particular inside is keeping at bay tonight. The fire is electric for you, or central heated, or the warmth of a building maintained by systems you don't have to feed or manage. The porridge, if you have it, requires a microwave rather than the iron pot hanging over the open fire. The dark outside your window has the orange smudge of light pollution rather than the full Norse sky. But the inside is the same inside. The warmth against the cold. The people, however many people you share your inside with, or however alone you are in it, held together by the building. The fire in whatever form. The specific quality of a winter evening when the outside is doing what it does and the inside is holding. You are Helga, naming the things that belong to you. You are Astrid, making the calculations that keep everyone alive. You are Leif, building something in your mind that you will take with you when you leave. You are Gunnar, standing in the doorway for 10 minutes in the dark because you need to, and then going back in. You are Ragnhild, carrying what you know and distributing it in the evenings, trusting that some of it will take root. You are Ulf, who has been here the longest of anyone and who goes to work in the morning because the work is here, and the morning is here, and the two are the same. The winter builds you. Not the summer, when the options are many and the world is open and the opportunities are everywhere. The winter, when the options are few and the world is closed and the building is the world, and the people in it are the people, and the fire is the fire. You have been built by your winters. Whatever winters they were. The Longhouse is 1,000 years away. The fjord is frozen in the same way it has been frozen for 1,000 years. The birch trees on the slope are different birch trees but the same birch trees, the line of them running forward through the centuries from the grandfathers planting to now, rooted in the same slope, catching the same April light. And in the building below them, the fire burns. Sleep. The spring will come when it comes. It always comes. You have been in a cold place tonight, a dark place, a human place, the most human kind of place, which is the enclosed place, the sheltered place, the inside that was built to hold the outside out. You have been with people who knew what it was to have very little and to make of it everything that the winter required. The warmth around you is their descendant. The comfort you have tonight is what they built toward. Sleep in it. Let the Longhouse go dark. Let the fire burn down to coals. Let the building settle into its night sounds, the creak of the timber, the breathing of the animals at the far end, the particular silence of 8 people asleep in the same space, the sounds of the winter outside going on without requiring anything from anyone inside. Sleep. The morning will come, the work will be there, the porridge will be made. And at some point in the spring, when the time is right, the animals will go outside, and a 6-year-old girl will laugh at the sound of a cow in the open air, and the winter will be over. Until then, the fire. Until then, the inside. Until then, this. Thank you for spending this winter night with us at Dull Tales. If this slow, immersive journey through history is how you like to spend your evenings, please subscribe. It genuinely helps a small channel find more people who need exactly this. Hit like if the long pace and the fire and the 9 months of winter were what you came for. Leave a comment telling me where you listened from tonight and whether you made it all the way to the spring. Next time we go back to Rome, or somewhere older, somewhere stranger, somewhere that will require its own long fire and its own long night. But that is next time. For now, the Longhouse is dark, the fire is low, the building settles. Good night.